Good afternoon, friends and comrades. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with Center for Political Education, joining you from the occupied lands of the Muncie and Alapi tribe in New York City. We encourage all our participants on this call located in the Bay Area to pay your Shumi land tax, which you can do by following the link in the chat. The chat is, as always, disabled for these calls, except for us to share information with the audience. If you have questions you'd like to get answered during the call, please use the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer them during the call, if not in our follow-up email. And in that same toolbar, you can find a CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window to enable closed captioning. And as usual, we're very grateful to have ASL interpreters with us throughout this call. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to our June 28th, 2024 Palestine Solidarity announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these are calls that are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways that you can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area and beyond. If you're returning, thanks as always for sticking with us, and please share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends. The recordings are available on CPE's YouTube channel. It's been a couple of weeks since we've last spoken, so we're glad to be back today. As several of us have been on the road, including yours truly, our program and production will be a little pared down today, but we still think it's imperative to share some of the critical updates on what's been happening. Whether you've been following the coverage of yesterday's dismal presidential debate or the destructive Supreme Court decisions of this morning, it's been impossible to escape the consequences of failed electoral strategies and the expanding reach of the far-right project. Palestine has been particularly enmeshed in U.S. elections this week, including in last night's debate, where former President Trump used Palestinian as an epithet, absurdly and ironically, against a flagging President Biden last night. We also started this week with Jabal Bowman's loss in his primary at the hands of millions upon millions of dollars of AIPAC lobby money, and just this week, the passage of a bill in the House that bans the State Department from citing statistics from the Gaza Health Ministry. To quote Representative Rashida Tlaib, who spoke on the floor on the latter, how absolutely unconscionable that my colleagues are offering an amendment to prevent our US government from even citing the Palestinian death toll, she said. Since 1948, there has been a coordinated effort, especially in this chamber, to dehumanize Palestinians and erase Palestinians from existence. The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians did not end in 1948, she continued. Today, we are witnessing the Israeli apartheid government carry out a genocide in Gaza, and in real time, this amendment is an attempt to hide it. To help us make sense of all that's been happening in the US domestic sphere with regard to Palestine, and of course, what's been happening in Palestine and now in front with Lebanon as well, we're going to bring up Samar Arabi from Iraq. Samar, it's great to have you with us again. Welcome back.
Thanks, Thomas. Good to be here. What a week. What a week. I'm sure that, like me, a lot of you are reeling from that bonkers debate yesterday / all the horrible things that have been happening at the Supreme Court, and obviously, oh, what a week for Palestine. Lots to go over, so should probably just jump right in. Just to say, it's been another week of some really intense attacks, both in Rafah and beyond. You know, we've been saying for a few weeks now that Israel seems like it is moving into a sort of quote unquote end game of the sort of structure that it's had for the invasion of Gaza since October. And that does seem to be the case, but the violence with which these sort of like final giant military maneuvers are taking place is really something. And I feel like it's sort of losing media attention in a way that's very troubling. You know, the fighting in Rafah is still ongoing. It's been over a month now, and the sort of large infrastructure of the area is gone. So now Rafah once the only place with sustained infrastructure in Gaza, is now just like the rest of the strip, which is, the word I heard is herbicide, like to destroy the urban environment in its totality. And just to note, they're not just in Rafah, right? These operations are still happening across the Gaza Strip. There's a really big on the ground fight right now happening in Gaza City, back in the north. And, folks who have been attending this for a little while will feel a sense of deja vu. This is maybe the third time in the past couple of months that we've talked about Israel going back into Gaza City. And, we spoke about a few weeks ago this idea that Hamas battalions are sort of like dissolving during direct Israeli offensives and then reconstituting as soon as Israel leaves. And that continues to be the case. So, you'll notice that now that the Israeli military has occupied all of Rafah, the sort of underlying justification of, oh, those three remaining Hamas battalions, nobody's talking about that anymore. And that's because A, that was always a fiction, and B, they can't even claim to have impacted that little piece directly. Meanwhile, the sort of massacres that underlie these military offensives continue unabated. There have been some really horrible ones in the last couple of weeks, including a horrific bombing at the El Mawasi refugee camp, which, just to take a moment to note the New York Times framing of this as a place where displaced Gazans were camped, and their like continued effort to minimize the sort of agency and humanity of Palestinians, and their willingness to cover for Israeli war crimes, like you're bombing a refugee camp, not a place where displaced Gazans are camped. Similarly, a direct hit on the Red Cross, which happened right around the same time that Israel had been claiming to be cooperating with the Red Cross on the investigation into Hind Rajab's murder, but that's a story unto itself. And a series of attacks, both literal and figurative, on UNRWA, which is a sort of continuing through line of the Israeli offensive. We've spoken several times about this sort of concerted Israeli effort to defund and delegitimize UNRWA as an institution that, by its very existence, recognizes a sovereign Palestine. Right? It's an institution designed to support Palestinians. So Israel really, really, really wants to get rid of UNRWA. And so not only was there another strike on an UNRWA aid center this past week, but there's a new lawsuit, a lawsuit against the UN alleging that Hamas skimmed UNRWA aid. And it's, in the New York Times typical flowery language, they describe the case as facing high legal hurdles, which is a very nice way of saying it's a totally unfounded accusation that is not based in any sort of material understanding of how UNRWA operates. I think, as I understand it, the underlying accusation is that UNRWA has to convert money from dollars into shekels, and the only money conversion offices in Gaza are run by Hamas, which, that's what happens when a group has government control of an area. Just to say that this is a sort of ongoing delegitimization campaign that unfortunately continues to be working. If you'll remember, Congress has banned U.S. funds going to UNRWA for at least another year as part of their humanitarian aid package. I also had apropos of nothing, a fascinating conversation with a Zionist guy that I ran into outside of the climbing gym, who wanted to talk to me about this UNRWA lawsuit. And I was like, okay, but all of the other UNRWA cases that Israel has thrown out there, remember the whole thing about how, there were a bunch of Hamas fighters that were working for UNRWA, and none of that actually turned out to be true. And he said, well, just because none of the past accusations have been right, does that mean that we can't accuse UNRWA in the future? I was like, okay, that explains a lot about how you think about these things. But yeah, just to say, more UNRWA nonsense coming down the pipe. given all of what's happening um, in the in Gaza, I think it's really important to understand it in the context of this IDF tactical shift, right? So the fact that people are talking about reducing military presence in Gaza, and that Israel seems to be refocusing on Lebanon. And now that there are these, they call them tactical pauses, where every day the Israeli military isn't fighting. All of that, I think, needs to be understood in the context of um, a like shifting focus for the Israeli military and a sort of political game that's being played around how to save face for what has been a really disastrous military endeavor for the Israeli state. We're seeing more and more that both outside observers and Israelis themselves are acknowledging that the war is lost and unwinnable. When Foreign Affairs magazine writes an article about how Hamas is winning, that's really not a good sign for Israel. Um, in the meantime, we also this past week, the IDF spokesperson like explicitly said, whoever thinks it's possible to destroy Hamas is mistaken. And again, this is something we've been talking about since October, but given like the stated goals of Israel's engagement in Gaza have all failed to be met, every single one. You know, um, the hostage rescue efforts have been a disaster. The idea of uprooting Hamas has totally failed. And it's resulted in a sort of like broad international condemnation around it. We are seeing Israel change its tactics around this as a result of that pressure and those failures. So it's the combo of like losing on the ground and all of the diplomatic pressure that might not be coming from the United States, but is coming from popular movements and other governments that is really increasing Israel's isolation and creating a really material impact. Um, which, in the context of all of that is, I think, how we need to think about what's happening with the current ceasefire proposals. Given that moment, that brief glimmer of hope that we were very close to a ceasefire, now seems very far away. And I think we need to understand the incentives of the parties of that and why that ceasefire hasn't been reached. And at its core, and we've talked about this for several weeks now, there's just no overlap between the Netanyahu government's position and Hamas's position, where Netanyahu specifically says he's only going to accept a partial deal that doesn't end the war, and Hamas says that any agreement that excludes a permanent ceasefire is not an agreement. And the reasons for this are clear, right? Hamas wants the war itself to end. There's no way that it would be willing to like give up all of the hostages that it's holding only for Israel to resume bombing them. Like it's just not something they would ever agree to. And Netanyahu can't accept a permanent ceasefire now, given that um, given that it's the moment they're in is a total defeat. So to accept a ceasefire now is to acknowledge this being the end of the conflict and him having accomplished nothing. And he is nothing if not a political animal. So the goal here, I think, is to keep this sort of ongoing military campaign at a low volume. Low volume, going to be horrific, while Israel tries to re-win legitimacy elsewhere. And you can even see in this screenshot here that Netanyahu is employing an old Israeli trope about Gaza, which is mowing the grass. It's a common thing that they've been saying for decades about how like, okay, we stay in Gaza and we just keep it at the basic bottom level of its possible existence. So like any attempt for Gaza to build infrastructure, any attempts to like build up systems of resilience will just periodically be destroyed. It's the tactic that worked very well for them in the West Bank, and that is, they're hoping to use to sort of continue their iron grip on Gaza, whether they're in the territory or not.
Hey, Samar, I'm going to interrupt just for a second. It sounds like
Sure.
some folks are having a little bit of audio issues with both mine and then yours. I'm going to run a quick poll while you're talking. just so that I can get a sense of whether or not it's a lot more people. So go
Yeah,
ahead. I just wanted to make sure other folks know that we're going to run the poll to figure out if it's more than one or two folks.
sure. Yeah, you also sounded patchy to me. I don't know if I also sound patchy to you. Maybe we all have bad internet today. I'll try to
Yeah.
speak very clearly if that helps. Um, yeah, I'm curious what the results of this poll will be. But I will keep going in the meantime. Just to note that, you know, in addition to the implications for a ceasefire in Gaza, we also really need to weigh the way that that ceasefire impacts the broader regional dynamics generally, and particularly the war between Israel and Lebanon that seems to be brewing, where everyone, regardless of their position on that war, recognizes the idea that the only, like the main way to make sure that this war doesn't happen is a ceasefire, right? And you know, Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon has said this explicitly that if there's a ceasefire, then conflict can end. But you know, Israel doesn't want to do that. They're not willing to go down that path, and the U.S. really critically isn't willing to pressure them to go down that path. There's this incredible quote from a senior Biden administration official who says, you know, that like Hezbollah says that this war is all tied to Gaza, and until there's a ceasefire in Gaza, the fighting won't stop, and that they, even knowing that, they reject the logic of that. So without a ceasefire, it's going to be really hard to rein in what's been happening in Lebanon. And what's making it even harder is that the US is providing explicit security guarantees for the Israeli state about a war with Lebanon, basically saying, if you engage in this war, we will back you fully, which, as you can imagine, is not exactly a de-escalatory incentive for the Israeli state. That's a sort of ongoing thing that we're seeing ratcheting up. It's particularly troublesome. It's particularly troublesome given the way in which that escalation is leading to increasing violence on that border, and without any sort of like indication for how it can be reined in. So we saw, in addition to like, you know, the Israeli military movement around this stuff, which, by the way, I went back through our PSAs to see the first time that we identified that Israel was planning on invading Lebanon, and that was, I think, in early May. So the fact that, you know, this has been a long planned military plan of the Israeli military. And I think a big part of it is that they're desperate for a win, right? They really need to, you know, first of all, they're really, they continue to be sore about getting their butts kicked when they tried to invade Lebanon in 2006. And so there's this idea that they can regain the honor that they lost from that really embarrassing defeat. And so, you know, you're seeing comments from Israeli political leaders like Benny Gantz saying that they're going to take Lebanon, quote, completely into the dark, right? Or return it to the Stone Age or whatever. Gantz gave that speech just a couple days ago at Reichman University, this university in Israel, that incredible location for his speech, because Reichman University spent, I think, 2 or 3 years putting together a report on what an Israeli invasion of Lebanon would look like. It's a fascinating, I definitely recommend giving it a read. It was written by like a series of IDF generals and other sort of, you know, military intelligence strategists, folks, that basically said that it would be absolutely catastrophic, that like Israel doesn't have the capabilities and infrastructure in an attack from Hezbollah, like a counter assault from Hezbollah. The US military put out a similar paper a while ago assessing what happened in the 2006 war. So if you want to really nerd out on some policy documents, the links for these will be in the slides. And just to say that no one seems to be prepared for how bad this will get. And the Israeli political class seems perfectly willing to keep driving this forward, despite the fact that, by all accounts, it's going to be really bad. You know, the military capability of Hezbollah is orders of magnitude above that of Hamas. You know, it's the largest non-state military, I think, in the world. So why they're willing to do this, I really can't wrap my head around how anyone thinks that this is a good strategic move. So it'll be weird to see what is going to happen going forward. Part of me still can't believe that they actually want to go through with this war, but every indication makes it seem like it's a very imminent thing. Meanwhile, I would say from what we've been hearing from Hezbollah, you know, if folks saw in the news, they released drone footage. They had like secret drones that were flying over Israeli military installations and, you know, urban areas. And they showed that they were able to strike like the Iron Dome missile defenses. The fact that Hezbollah is publicizing its ability to do these things, I think is a really clear indication that they don't want this war. You know, a common theme of these updates is when a military actor is telling you about a thing it can do, it means it probably really doesn't want to use that thing. Otherwise, they would shut up about it and then just use it. So what that means is hard to say, but like it's clear that Hezbollah seems to be trying to de-escalate. But whether that'll be effective or not, given that it seems to be baked into Israeli military plans, hard to say. And just to note that like Israel feels emboldened to do this right now, and that's something we're seeing written about quite directly, partly because you know the European elections swung hard right, partly because the Biden administration continues to back it to the hilt, and because they're anticipating a better U.S. political environment next year. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but you know, the fact that they're already making claims about hidden weapons in the Beirut airport is an indication that they're probably planning on bombing the Beirut airport. So bad signs all around. It's looking really scary. And yeah, the ability of this to spiral out is also very scary. Meanwhile, inside Israel, things are not looking very good either. You know, there's this ongoing battle over drafting ultra-Orthodox folks into the military. You know, right now they have a carve-out exception, which, as you can imagine, given the whole country is mobilized for war, is a really big fracture point. The ultra-Orthodox folks make up over 10% now of Israel's total population. And they're a core part of the Netanyahu coalition because they're these hard right voters. So how that's going to play out is a complicated thing that we could spend a lot of time on, but maybe if folks have questions. And then obviously the sort of friction with the ultra hard right members of that cabinet, including Smotrich, who I didn't put it in here because I didn't think we had time to get into it too much, but like has put forth an official plan to annex 60% of the West Bank, which is something that, you know, Trump has already said that he would be okay with. So there's a lot going on there as they sort of play the US electoral game. And on the global stage, Israel's getting hurt, right? Israel and its defenders. I think an incredible move in the past week was that the Anti-Defamation League, those folks that, you know, the purported civil rights organization that mostly talks about why we're not, like why we should send more weapons to Israel and, you know, spends its time bashing anti-war demonstrations, has now been pulled from Wikipedia as a reliable source on anti-Semitism. That like the ADL, which was founded to combat anti-Semitism, is no longer considered a reliable source of anti-Semitism because they've infused their purported anti-Semitism work with like pro-Israel propaganda. So they've, in conflating those two things, they're no longer a reliable source on that, which duh, but it's nice that the world has acknowledged this now. The Norwegian pension funds, like the official public funds, have divested from Caterpillar, which is a really big BDS win. Similarly, at like the international court level, slash like the UN, there were two really powerful UN reports that came out in the past couple of weeks. One from the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Palestine, the other from the Human Rights Council, that really blasted Israel's war crimes, basically saying that they're deliberately targeting civilians. The press conference from the Commission of Inquiry, the head of the commission called the IDF one of the most evil armies in the world based on its actions in Gaza, which again, not great for the IDF. More countries are recognizing Palestine. Armenia just recognized Palestine this week. So all of this is sort of, we're seeing a continued shift on the global stage of the isolation of the state of Israel and its like descent into pariah statehood. We're just not seeing a similar shift in the United States, right? And I think that's counterbalancing a lot of the lost legitimacy that's happening in other arenas. So yeah, there's more to talk about that, and I will hopefully loop around to it. Um, and just to say, the ICC is also in a really weird spot right now. You know, like there was that request from Karim Khan to issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his defense minister, Yoav Gallant. And you know, we've spoken about on previous PSAs how Karim Khan is no friend to the Palestinians. And now, sure enough, the ICC process is getting bogged down. The UK is trying to like drag it back into questions of the ICC's jurisdiction over Palestine, which is a thing that they settled 3 years prior. The ICC itself is issuing statements trying to clarify the difference between an arrest warrant and a summons to appear. So like, you know, when we think someone has committed war crimes, sometimes we issue an arrest warrant, but sometimes we just issue a summons, meaning that please turn yourself into the nearest court when you get a chance. And the fact that they're putting this out right now, worrying. I think it likely implies that instead of issuing arrest warrant for Netanyahu, they're going to issue a summons to appear. But hard to say yet. We'll find out not very soon, thanks to the UK delaying this, but somewhat soon. Meanwhile, despite US unflagging support and despite the Biden administration's willingness to back Israel almost to the hilt, you know, Biden seems to have drawn the line at providing those 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs. That is enough for the Israeli like political class to actively campaign to get Biden out of office and to undermine his like remaining legitimacy for whatever tiny tatters of legitimacy that Biden has left. By like, you know, I don't know if folks saw the Biden admin went apoplectic this past week because Netanyahu accused them of holding weapons shipments. And when Netanyahu said this, he was referring, he wanted to make it sound as broad as possible, but the only weapon shipment the US has withheld were those 2,000-pound bombs, which again, like 2-ton bombs that you're dropping on Gaza is obviously meant to eradicate large numbers of civilians, no question. And so the White House is really mad that Netanyahu called them out for stopping one weapon shipment. And like, it's clear that the Israeli state is now engaging itself in a much deeper way into US elections to make sure that, as happened with the EU elections, that there's an outcome that's a little bit more favorable or less willing to criticize Israel's ongoing war crimes. And I think a really clear example of that I think warrants a lot of reflection from us is what happened with Jamal Bowman, you know, this member of the squad, one of the earliest folks to call for a ceasefire, who lost pretty horribly in New York a few days ago on Tuesday to a Democrat who is a pretty hard right-winger, who even the New York Times describes as to the right of President Biden on Israel. And you can see here AIPAC crowing about their win. You know, this is after AIPAC put in something around $20 million into the election to defeat Jamal Bowman. And we've talked about this, but like to give you a sense of that scale, the average congressional race in its totality is usually about $2 million. And this was $20 million from one actor on one side, the most of any congressional campaign in US history. So it became really clear that AIPAC wanted to send an extremely strong message saying, members of Congress who criticize Israel will get kicked out. And in this case, they did it. They did it, and very effectively. Bowman lost by at least something around 17%, which is a pretty big gap. And the final votes aren't in, but it's a loss. I mean, it's a real loss. And I did want to take a minute to talk about this because I think a lot of people have called out Bowman for a series of poor votes and poor statements that he has previously made. Bowman voted to fund the Israel's Iron Dome. He went on like a trip sponsored by a Zionist organization to visit Israel. But really critically, and I think what a lot of people miss from those conversations is that that trip, despite being funded by a Zionist organization, was a like life-changing moment for Jamal Bowman, and he describes it as something that changed his understanding of the situation in Palestine, and where he saw that what Palestinians were going through was so akin to the struggle for Black liberation here in the United States. And since then, his voting record has been very different. And I put a lot of the quotes from this Politico article in here. I think it's definitely worth reading. This came out well before he lost the primary, but just to say that like Bowman was speaking explicitly about how AIPAC is an enemy of democracy, and that like it's incumbent on him and the rest of the movement to destroy AIPAC, and that all military aid to Israel should be stopped, and that we should force a ceasefire. Like these are very good positions. And that I don't think necessarily means that Bowman is like a savior of the Palestinian people. It doesn't mean that he's like an ideal person that embodies all of our values. He almost certainly is not. But in this broader fight, we have lost terrain, right? Like the loss of Bowman in this position is not only replacing one person who at least agreed with our objectives of stopping military aid to Israel and ending like this current phase of the genocide. It's not only replacing that person with the right-wing Zionist who owes his election to the Israel lobby and therefore will do whatever they want, but also it has an impact across the political spectrum because of what this implies for other politicians who may have had a different position if they felt like they could say something without the risk of AIPAC costing them their entire political career. And like, that sucks. We, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to rely on self-interested politicians to advance any of our goals. And like, just to be very blunt about it, like the United States Congress is obviously not the path to Palestinian liberation. That is not the terrain on which we will win. But it is a space where, depending on our actions, we make things easier or harder for ourselves. And the loss of Bowman's campaign is a loss for our ability to move forward in this movement. And I've got a quote from Cori Bush here, who is AIPAC's next target, about what happened and how AIPAC is a threat to democracy. But also critically, there's a fascinating article in The Guardian recently about Israel's covert operation to shape not only the US discourse around the Gaza war, but specifically the US electoral landscape. And a big part of that has actually been a coordinated effort to divide the movement, right? And to exploit our language and to exploit our values and principles in a way that causes fissures within the broader pro-Palestine movement as it's, most widely constituted. And that's scary, right? Like, there's no question that they encouraged people to turn away from Jamal Bowman in a moment that he probably needed our support. Um, and so, like, I think it's really incumbent on us, like, it's easy for like a Twitter message or like, a social media post to kind of point out some past like bad voting that Jamal Bowman had done without the context of him changing his mind about those votes. And even if he didn't change his mind about those votes, like about where he was politically positioned in this moment as a like strong enemy of AIPAC. So I think it really speaks to our need to kind of like engage with uh, the like political landscape of the country in which we operate in a way that has a little more nuance that, the Democratic Party won't save us. The Democratic Party doesn't represent us. And, like the head of the Democratic Party is a genocider. And we need to be able to hold all of that and understand that um, like we can't, the Democratic Party is a large, complex set of factors that some of which can be moved strategically to our advantage, not as the end goal of what we're doing, but as a part of building a more consolidated movement with fewer obstacles in our way. There's a great article about this in Convergence magazine. I think if you read one thing from the slides this week, this is probably what I would recommend that you read. And just, yeah, like helps break down all the different components of how a party operates and how change occurs, and I think it's important to remember that these fights are taking place as part of a series of broader fights that we have to contest every front that we can possibly contest, even ones that are really stacked against us, like the Democratic Party, which is run, as we saw for folks who watched the election yesterday, run by ghouls who are clearly not interested in anything even remotely democratic about its processes. And yet, there are terrains within there in which we can struggle. And when we lose, those losses compound. That I don't know, like one thing that has happened in the past few days is the union workers who have been striking at the UCs because of the way that Palestine protests were attacked. The California state legislators who had previously been very strong on like union rights issues have now turned against this idea that striking union workers should get benefits. Not union workers striking on Palestine, but any union striking won't be able to retain benefits, partly because legislators turned against that position because they saw unions aligning themselves with Palestine. That weakens us, but it also weakens our allies, allies that have been throwing down for Palestine that also need us to be throwing down for them. So like, it's important to remember that even these small elections really do materially impact the environment that we operate in and that constrain our ability to organize in a way that is important. Thomas spoke at the top about this congressional bill that passed the House that bans the State Department from using Gaza death toll figures. That happened the same day as Jamal Bowman's defeat, and that's not a coincidence, And the last, and one more thing that I just wanted to reflect on about that is just how it also impacts the presidential race, right? Like, I think we've been talking here every week for months about what a monster Joe Biden has been, what like an uncompromising, genociding nightmare Joe Biden has been. And we're now in a moment, if folks saw the debate yesterday, where there is, for the first time outside of like our left movement spaces, real conversation about replacing him at the top of the ticket. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. And I would encourage folks to reflect on how the conversation around that today would be different if Jamal Bowman had won on Tuesday, because those two things combined would have been a really clear narrative that the Democratic Party establishment is out of touch with voters, and that if Biden were to be replaced, he would have to be replaced by somebody that more represented like broader electoral interests, which would be a more pro-Palestine position, not a position that would be in line with what ours would be, but it would be more to the left of where Biden is now. And so that itself, I think, in a way, is a loss that we need to grapple with. And in the context of all of these losses, the last thing that I wanted to touch on is what it looks like to win. And this really, I think, flew under the radar for a lot of people. But I wanted to take a moment to showcase the Democratic Party of Texas, their new 2024 party platform, which includes things like supporting the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, dismantling Israeli settlements in the West Bank, supporting the ICJ in its genocide case against Israel, recognizing the Nakba as an act of dispossession of Palestinians. These are strong platform bases, right? Like these, it feels inconceivable for the California Democratic Party to hold this. And that's because folks actually contested the Democratic Party in Texas in a way that moved them. Now, is the Texas Democratic Party going to liberate Palestine? It is not. Is the platform full of things that we don't like? It is. But this is still better than the alternative. Like one of the things that this platform calls for is decriminalizing boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns against Israel, which right now the state of Texas has banned as hate speech. So that materially impacts our ability to organize. So yeah, I think it's important to reflect on how we can build a better environment for us to operate in. So, given all of that, my quick summation of my long yammer today. As Israel shifts its tactics in Gaza, we're moving to a West Bankification strategy, right? Where they're chopping up Gaza into chunks and then periodically raiding those chunks. Meanwhile, the broader military focus is shifting to Lebanon, where war is looking very likely, partly because a ceasefire is looking unlikely. And it's hard to really know what the next phase of this will look like, but Israel struggles to achieve its nominal objectives. I agree with somebody put something in the Q&A, I think, about one of their objectives being genocide. Yeah, that they are absolutely achieving, but I think they would have preferred to be able to do that within a context where at least their nominal objectives were achieved. The fact that everything they said they were going to do failed makes it harder for them to do the sort of bigger campaign. The growing isolation of Israel is being countered by US government support and by a global political environment that feels like it's shifting a bit to the right. And part of that, at least here, is because AIPAC is flexing its muscle and it's winning. And so as a movement, we really need to continue to fight on all fronts and understand our role, particularly in the United States, as being in the belly of the beast and what we can do to change the material conditions around the repression of the Palestinian cause. In the context of all of that, some things to do. There's a lot of things around Pride this weekend that I'd really encourage folks to go to. Our wonderful allies at Lavender Phoenix have some cool stuff coming up. And our wonderful allies at Quit also have some cool stuff coming up. There's also, I'd really encourage folks to take a moment to sign a petition about some California legislation that's working its way through right now, which is in direct response to the student Palestine movements on campuses. So we want to make sure to protect our students who have been standing up for Palestine. And there's a lot more that you should check out on the calendar and whatnot. And the last thing I'll plug, given that I went on a bit of a electoral ramble today, is there are folks working on electoral campaigns to support pro-Palestine progressives who are running for office. And Cori Bush, the one who introduced the ceasefire resolution in Congress, who has previously said that, like she came up in Ferguson. That was like the movement that brought her into political work. And in that movement, seeing the parallels between Ferguson and Palestine as a core part of how she understands repression in the United States as being an echo of the repression of Palestinians in Palestine. So her primary is August 6th, just to note. Please do keep tabs on the calendar in case there are other things that you can come to. You can go to bit.ly/Gaza events to attend future events. If you want to stay up to date on our text system, just text PSA to 833-633-0604. We really only send you about one text a month, I think, but also reminders to come to the PSAs. And if you want to stay on top of the news more broadly and the sort of articles that get pulled into these weekly updates, just sign up for the Palestine Media Tracker. You can just go to palmediatracker.com/sign up, and that'll take you to a simple form to subscribe. And I think that was it. That was a lot of rambling. My apologies, Thomas, but thank you all.
Sam, or no apologies needed. At least your audio was working, so I'm sure people appreciate that. Before we go, Sammer mentioned some of the actions that are ahead, from Lavender Phoenix and Quit, and just for a little bit more, Mara has put it in the chat. And if you don't know anything about Lavender Phoenix or Quit, which is Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism, we'll drop some links in the chat right now just so folks can follow our comrades at those organizations and support their work as well. We'll be back next week, and hopefully without any audio issues, and hopefully with some more better news. I think to Sammer's point, I think there is a lot going on multiple fronts and some key questions of strategy on the left, both with regard to how to engage in the domestic sphere around the elections, and then also with regard to the constant question that we've been engaging in, which is how to continue effective pressure. And as usual, shout out to all of our comrades who continue to engage in direct actions on a regular basis. We'll try to do more to sort of uplift and remind folks that there are actions happening with some regularity each week, both on the West Coast and East Coast and everywhere in between. So stay tuned. Again, keep sharing these PSAs out and get folks to attend. And then we will also continue to post the recordings on YouTube, including today's sometime later today. Thanks everyone for following us, and we will see you soon. Free Palestine.